The last time I saw the Hooghly River, it was the color of weak tea under a winter sun, and the ferry horns sounded like tired animals. I stood on the platform at Harrow with a kit bag that was too light to be called a soldier's life, and too heavy to be called anything else. My mother had tried to pack food for a week as if the train itself would run out of land before it reached Bombay. She wrapped lucha and fried fish in newspaper, then wrapped the newspaper in cloth, then wrapped the cloth in her silence. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who spent tears before she knew what they would buy. My sister Amina did cry, but only once quickly, as if she was ashamed of the sound. She pressed something into my palm, a small tin of lip balm, the kind sailors used. For the desert, she said, like she had already accepted where I was going. I'm not even sure it's the desert, I told her. She looked at me the way older sisters do, with a calm that feels like scolding. If they need men, it's always the desert, she said. That was 1941, and in Calcutta the war was still mostly a thing you read in the paper or heard in the clipped voice of the radio announcer who made every disaster sound tidy. We said Europe the way people say storm, something far away that could still knock down your roof. I had been a telegraph clerk at the port, translating other people's urgency into dots and dashes. When the recruiting officer came with his posters of clean uniforms and straight-backed men, he did not promise glory. He promised wages, rations, and a future that did not depend on whether the ships came in on time. He said the Japanese were pushing, that Malaya was in danger, that if the lines broke then, the war would not stay in Europe. I told myself I was joining to protect home. That is the story every man tells himself at the start. It is the easiest story to carry. On the train, the compartment smelled of coal smoke and nervous sweat. Across from me sat a Sikh havildar with a beard like a black waterfall and hands scarred from work I could not guess. He watched me fold and unfold a letter from Amina. You write, he asked. I read more than I write, I said. He smiled. Writing saves you, he said. When the world becomes mud, you put your clean thoughts on paper, then you know you were once a man, not only a body. I would remember that sentence later, in places where the world was not mud but sand, and where clean thoughts were harder to find than water. We trained outside Bombay first, parades, drills, the language of orders that turned men into one creature with many feet. I was assigned to signals, not because I was brave, but because I could already hear meaning in the crackle of a wire. They taught me how to lay cable fast, how to mend it faster, how to keep my hands steady when someone else's life depended on a sentence traveling through copper. In the evenings, we sat under mosquito nets and argued about what the war meant. Some men spoke of the King Emperor as if he was family. Others spoke of freedom in the same breath as sacrifice, their voices low, because walls had ears and authorities had notebooks. I did not argue. At 22, I still believed that if I did my job well, history would treat me gently. I did not understand that history does not treat anyone gently. It only chooses who gets remembered. In early 1942, they put us on a ship that smelled of rope, diesel, and old fear. The sea was an endless metal sheet with the sun hammering it flat. There were British soldiers aboard two pale young men who turned red in the heat and joked about everything, as if laughter could build shade. One of them, a driver named Thomas Bennett, shared cigarettes with me on the deck at night. He was from Manchester. He had a habit of speaking as if he was always halfway through a story. You ever seen snow? He asked. Only in pictures, I said. He shook his head like that was a crime. When this is all over, he said, you'll come, I'll show you proper snow, not just a photograph. What will you show me? I asked. He grinned. How to complain about the cold with dignity. We're masters of it. It was the kind of friendship war makes. Quick, unplanned, built out of the simple need to hear another human voice in a place too wide for comfort. When we reached Egypt, the air itself felt different, dry, sharp, as if it could cut you if you breathed too hard. The desert was not romantic like the poems. It was practical and cruel. Sand got into your food, your eyes, your teeth. The sky was enormous and empty, and at night the stars looked close enough to touch, which only made you feel smaller. Our camp was a patch of tents and vehicles near a rail line. Men moved like ants with purpose, hauling crates, checking engines, cleaning weapons that looked too clean to be used. Everyone was waiting for something. Waiting is what armies do when they are not dying. In March, we heard the first real news of disaster. Singapore had fallen. Men who had believed the British were invincible began to speak less. When an empire bleeds, even the smallest soldier can smell it. A Punjabi signaller named Yusuf shared my tent. He was older than me by 10 years and had the patient eyes of a man who had already learned that courage is mostly habit. "You're quiet," he said one night as we lay on our cots. "I was thinking of home," I said. He nodded. "Home is not a place," he said. "Home is what you imagine when you're afraid. That's why it becomes so beautiful in war." Then he told me about his village near Sialkot, about his mother's hands kneading dough, about the canal water in summer. His voice was steady, but I could hear what he did not say, that he was afraid he would never see it again. I wrote to Amina when I could, short letters that could survive censor and distance. I told her the desert was like the inside of a clay oven. I told her I had made friends. I did not tell her that sometimes, when the wind shifted, you could smell burning fuel from far away, and it made the whole horizon feel like a warning. The first time I saw a man die, it was not heroic. We were laying cable along a shallow trench when the sound came, a low, rising whistle that made your bones recognize danger before your mind did. Someone yelled, "Down," but the word was swallowed by the blast. Sand punched my face. The air turned thick, full of grit and smoke. When I lifted my head, my ears were ringing so loudly I thought the world had gone silent behind it. Yusuf was shouting my name, his mouth moving like a fish out of water. I could not hear him at first. Then sound returned in pieces, distant engines, men yelling, another whistling shell. I crawled toward the cable spool, hands shaking. A young sepoy I had seen at breakfast, he had asked for extra tea and laughed when the cook scolded him, was lying on his side as if he had decided to nap. His eyes were open. There was blood at his temple, dark against the pale sand. For a second my mind refused it. It tried to turn it into something else, sleep, fainting, a joke. Then a medic ran past and did not stop, and that was when I understood. Death, I learned, is often recognized not by what it does to the dead, but by how quickly the living move on. We repaired the cable anyway. Signals cannot mourn with their hands. The line had to work. Orders had to travel. Guns had to be told where to fire and when to stop. That night I vomited behind a fuel drum and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand like a child. I sat there for a long time, ashamed not of fear, but of how small my body felt compared to the machinery of war. I wanted to be brave in the way stories are brave, clean, decisive, meaningful. Instead, I was brave in the way men actually are. I did not run away. I did not stop doing my job. I breathed through panic until it became just another part of the air. Tom found me there. He crouched beside me, offered his canteen without a word. In the moonlight, his face looked older. "First one?" he asked. I nodded. He stared out into the darkness where the guns flashed like distant lightning. "You'll remember his face," he said, "and then one day you won't. That's the part that messes you up, not the remembering, the forgetting." I did not answer. I did not know how. A week later, we moved closer to the front. The names of places started to matter. Gazala, Tobruk, El Adem, names that sounded like prayers or curses depending on who was saying them. We heard Rommel's name spoken with a respect that annoyed me. It felt wrong to admire the man who was trying to kill you. The retreat began not with a trumpet, but with a change in tone. Officers stopped speaking in full explanations. Trucks were loaded faster. Maps were consulted more often, then folded away as if they contained secrets too heavy to show. One afternoon, a British major called our section together. His sleeves were rolled up. His hands were dusty. He had the tired authority of a man who knew the difference between what should happen and what will happen. "We're pulling back tonight," he said. "Signals will be last out. We keep the line open until the infantry is clear. Then you cut and move, understood?" "Understood," we said. Yusuf leaned toward me. "Last out," he murmured. "That means we will see everything." As the sun went down, the horizon turned the color of old bruises. The desert cooled quickly, but the tension in our bodies stayed hot. We ran cable to an observation post, checked the set, relayed messages in a rhythm that became almost calming. Coordinates, acknowledgements, corrections, a constant invisible thread. Then the shelling started again, closer this time. The ground trembled under my knees. In the dim light, men ran with shapes on their backs, ammunition, stretchers, wounded friends. Someone screamed for a medic, and the word carried across the sand like a bird with a broken wing. At the edge of the trench line, I saw a figure staggering toward us. For a moment, I thought it was an enemy. My hand went to my rifle, clumsy with sweat. Then I recognized the helmet, the uniform. It was Tom. His face was streaked with dust and something darker. He stumbled, caught himself, then nearly fell again. I ran to him and grabbed his arm. "What happened?" I shouted. His eyes found mine. They were wide, not with fear, but with the focused terror of a man trying to keep a single thought alive. "Truck hit a mine," he said, each word sharp and separate. "There's lads stuck by the Wadi, I couldn't." Another explosion cut him off. He flinched like a dog under a stick, then gripped my sleeve with surprising strength. "Arif," he said, and the way he said my name made it feel like a responsibility. "I need a wire, radio's dead. If we can get a message through, they'll send a carrier if we don't." He did not finish. Behind him, the night filled with the chaotic music of retreat. Engines revving, boots on sand, shouted orders, the steady hammer of guns. Somewhere out there, men were pinned down in a place that would not appear in any newspaper. I looked back at Yusuf. He had heard everything. His jaw tightened. He did not ask what we should do. He only said quietly, "Choose quickly. War does not wait for the good in you." My mouth went dry. In training, they had taught us procedure. Maintain lines, follow orders, protect equipment. They had not taught us what to do when a friend's voice makes you feel that your orders are suddenly too small. Tom's grip on my sleeve tightened. "Please," he said, and there was no shame in it, just urgency. I could already imagine Amina's face if she knew I had ignored a man asking for help. I could also imagine my mother's silence if I never came back because I had gone where I was not told to go. The desert offered no advice, it only waited. I took a breath that felt like swallowing sand and said, "Show me where." And as we moved into the dark, carrying a spool of wire like a lifeline, the gunfire seemed to lean toward us, as if the night itself had decided to listen. Tom led us low along a shallow depression in the sand that everyone called a wadi even when it was bone dry. The moon was thin, the kind that made shapes uncertain. In the distance, flares rose and fell, slow white flowers opening over the battlefield, turning men into shadows for a second, then swallowing them again. Yusuf carried the telephone set in its canvas case. I had the wire spool slung across my shoulder, and with each step it bumped my back like a hand, urging me forward and warning me at the same time. "You sure about this?" Yusuf asked, not trying to stop me, only checking whether I was still thinking. "No," I said, "but I'm going anyways." Tom glanced over his shoulder. "It's not far," he said, though his voice had the tone of a man lying to himself for courage. As we moved, the desert stopped being open and became crowded. Not with buildings, but with invisible dangers, mines, tripwires, unseen riflemen. Every footstep felt like a question. "Where's the minefield?" I asked Tom. He swallowed. "There's tape, white tape, we marked a path." "Who marked it?" Yusuf asked. Tom didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was quiet. The ones who made it out. Ahead, a strip of white fluttered weakly from a short stake, then another. The tape looked harmless, almost childish, like the decorations you'd see at a fair. I hated it for that. Something that small had no right to hold so much meaning. We followed the tape single file, placing our boots exactly where the man in front had stepped. I could hear my own breath loud in my head. Somewhere to our left, a machine gun chattered, then stopped, as if it had run out of patience. The truck appeared suddenly, half in the wadi, half on the slope, its front end crumpled as if a giant had punched it. One wheel was gone. The air around it smelled of burnt rubber and hot metal, sharp enough to make my eyes sting. Two men were crouched behind the wreck. One of them raised his rifle when he saw us, then lowered it. "Bennett," he hissed. His voice broke on Tom's name as if it hurt to say it. "You came back." Tom raised his hands in a quick, helpless gesture. "I brought signals," he said. "We'll get a message through." In the flare light, I saw the faces of the two men, young, dust-caked, their eyes shining with the rawness of shock. One had a bandage around his forearm that was already turning dark. The other kept glancing back into the wadi, like he was afraid of what he might see there. "How many?" Yusuf asked. The uninjured man licked his lips. "4 in the truck, 2 dead, 2 alive, I think, one's pinned." Pinned, the word landed inside me with weight. I knelt and set the wire spool down carefully, as if sudden movement could wake the minds. My hands worked by habit, find the end, free it, start paying it out. The copper line slid over the sand with a soft hiss, almost peaceful. Yusuf opened the telephone set and checked the battery with a practiced flick. "We need a point to tie into," he said. I looked back toward our lines. "If we run it to that ridge, we can connect to the field exchange." Tom shook his head quickly. "No time for the ridge. There's a carrier track behind the trucks. If we can get a message to them, they'll send an armored vehicle. They're closer." "Closer isn't helpful if I can't connect," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Yusuf lifted his chin toward a darker shape near the Wadi wall. There, he said, cable. At first I thought it was a shadow. Then I saw it, a line half buried running along the Wadi like a vein. Old field cable from some earlier position, abandoned, perhaps damaged, perhaps still alive. Could be dead, I said. Could be alive, Yusuf replied. War is full of surprises. He crawled toward it, moving carefully, one knee at a time, as if the sand itself might explode from insult. I followed, heart banging in my chest. We reached the cable. Yusuf brushed sand away and exposed the rubber sheath. Cut, he said. I took out my knife. My fingers were clumsy, sweating inside the grip. I sliced the insulation, then peeled it back. Copper glinted faintly. Yusuf stripped our line, twisted the ends together with the old cable. He wrapped the join with tape, then wrapped it again. Now, he said, and opened the set. He clipped the lids on, his hands steady in a way that felt unreal. He cranked the handle. A faint crackle answered. Yusuf's eyes met mine. For the first time since we left the trench line, I felt a small lift in my chest, like a drowning man finding something solid. He spoke into the handset, voice crisp and controlled. Hello, hello, signals detachment forward, do you read? The handset hissed. A voice came back, distant and irritated, as if we were calling from a bad dream. Who is this? Say again. Yusuf leaned closer. We have a disabled transport at grid. He paused, looked at Tom. Tom rattled off coordinates with shaking lips. Yusuf repeated them cleanly. We have wounded, request immediate carrier pickup along marked tape path. Mines present, over. The voice on the line went silent for a moment, then stand by. Stand by, another harmless phrase with a terrible meaning. Behind us, one of the trapped men cried out from inside the truck, hoarse, furious, not the sound of pain alone but of fear trying to disguise itself. The uninjured soldier flinched like he'd been struck. We should get them out, Tom said. With what? I asked. With hands, Tom snapped, then softened, immediately ashamed. Sorry, just please. I crawled back toward the truck. The sand felt colder here in the Wadi's shadow. I kept my eyes on the tape path, terrified of drifting a few inches. At the wreck, the injured man with the bandaged arm pointed with his chin. The driver's side, he's pinned under the dash. Tom climbed up carefully, gripping the torn metal, then leaned in. Charlie, he shouted. Charlie, you hear me? A weak voice answered, thick with dust. Tom. I'm here, Tom said too quickly. We're getting you out. A flare went up somewhere, bright as a small sun. For a second the scene was frozen in brutal clarity. The torn truck, the men's faces, Yusuf crouched by the cable like a priest at a thin altar, and me with my hands on the wreck, pretending I knew how to undo metal. Then the flare died and darkness returned, and the darkness felt worse because it had shown us everything first. We need leverage, I said, scanning the ground. A crowbar, a jack, anything. The uninjured soldier shoved a hand into the sand near the truck's rear and pulled out a tool kit half buried. Here, he said, we tried. We got the jack out, its metal cold and gritty. Tom and I positioned it under a bent section of the frame, trying to find a point that would lift without shifting the truck sideways. Sideways meant mines, sideways meant death. Slow, Yusuf called, not looking away from the telephone. No sudden movements. I started turning the jack handle. It squealed softly. The metal rose a fraction. The trapped man, Charlie, gasped, then cursed. Easy, Tom said, voice breaking. Easy, mate. Another sound cut into the night, the rising, tearing scream of an aircraft diving. Stuka, someone yelled, whether from our group or far away I couldn't tell. The dive bomber's scream came closer, twisting my nerves into wire. I wanted to flatten myself into the sand to become nothing, but my hands kept turning the jack handle because stopping felt like choosing who would die. The bomb hit somewhere beyond the Wadi. The ground jumped, sand rained down, the truck shuddered, and for a second I thought it would slip off the jack. Tom lunged, bracing it with his shoulder like he could hold the world steady by will. Keep turning, he shouted. I turned faster, tears in my eyes from dust and terror. The gap widened just enough. Tom reached in, grabbed Charlie under the arms. The injured soldier with the bandage grabbed Charlie's belt. Together they pulled, inch by inch, the way you pull a heavy sack that you're afraid will split. Charlie's legs dragged free. He screamed once, then bit down hard on his own sleeve to swallow the rest. We laid him on the sand beside the truck, on the safe side of the tape. His face was gray under the dust. His hands shook violently, but he was alive. There's another one, the uninjured soldier said. His voice sounded smaller now, like a child reporting bad news. Where? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be inside. He pointed into the wreck. Back seat, he's not moving. Tom climbed in again. He moved more slowly this time, like each movement was borrowed courage. He disappeared into the torn cabin. For several seconds there was only the distant gunfire and the faint creak of the truck settling. Then Tom's voice came out flat and careful. He's gone. No one spoke, even the desert seemed to pause. Yusuf's voice cut through, low but urgent. Message received, he said, hand covering the mouthpiece. Carrier is on the way, 10 minutes. 10 minutes? In war, 10 minutes can be a lifetime, or it can be nothing. I looked up at the ridgeline. The sky was streaked with distant flashes. Somewhere out there, men were moving and dying because someone else had decided where a line should be drawn on a map. And here we were, in a small pocket of darkness, trying to steal 3 lives back from a machine that did not care. Tom knelt by Charlie. He poured a little water into Charlie's mouth. Charlie coughed and choked, then swallowed. You'll be all right, Tom said, though his eyes said he didn't know. Charlie tried to smile. It came out crooked. You always were a stubborn bastard, he whispered. Tom laughed once, a short, broken sound. Takes one to know one. The aircraft came again, not diving this time, but passing overhead like a great shadow. I held my breath until it moved on. We waited. In the waiting, my mind did something cruel. It brought Amina's face to me, not as a memory, but as if she were standing at the edge of the Wadi, watching. In her eyes, I saw the question she would never ask out loud. Is this what you became? I wanted to answer her. I wanted to tell her I was still her brother, still the boy who once got lost in the market and cried until she found me by the sweet seller's stall. But my mouth was full of sand and silence. A faint engine noise rose from behind us. It grew into a steady rumble. A low silhouette appeared, an armored carrier, moving cautiously, followed by another vehicle with its lights covered. They stopped at the first tape marker. A soldier climbed out, helmet low, weapon ready. Where's the wounded? He called. Here, Tom shouted, waving once, then immediately lowering his arm as if he'd remembered waving could attract bullets. The carrier edged forward along the tape path, wheels following it like a train on invisible rails. It came close enough that I could see the driver's eyes through the slit, hard, focused. The soldiers jumped down and lifted Charlie onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency. Charlie groaned, then grabbed Tom's sleeve. Don't leave, he said, voice thick with fear. Tom held his hand for a second. I'm right here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Charlie's grip loosened as the stretcher was loaded. The bandaged soldier climbed in after him. The uninjured one hesitated, looking at the truck, then at us. His eyes were wet and angry. We can't leave him, he said, meaning the dead man inside. One of the carrier soldiers shook his head. Not tonight, he said. Not with mines, not with air. We come back when we can. The uninjured soldier's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Then he climbed in, because living men do what they are told even when it tears them. Tom watched the carrier back out, slow and careful. When it turned and disappeared into the night, something in his posture collapsed. He stood there with his hands hanging uselessly, staring at the place where the vehicle had been. Yusuf came over, the telephone set slung across his shoulder again. We should go, he said. Tom didn't answer. Yusuf's voice softened. Tom. Tom blinked hard. Yeah, he said. Yeah, right. We started back along the tape, retracing each step as if the sand remembered us. Halfway up the Wadi slope, the wind shifted and brought the smell of smoke again. The battle was moving, flowing like a dark tide. When we reached the point where we had tapped into the old cable, Yusuf stopped. We should disconnect, I said. Yusuf looked at the join, then at me. Leave it, he said. Why? He shrugged, because someone else might need a miracle too. We moved faster now, adrenaline pushing us, fatigue trying to pull us down. My shoulders ached from the wire spool. Tom walked with his head lowered, as if he was carrying a weight no one could see. When our trench line came into view, it was already half empty. Vehicles were pulling out in staggered lines. Men shouted to one another over engines. The retreat was not a single movement but hundreds of small movements, each one trying not to become panic. A British officer ran up as we arrived, his face pale in the moonlight. Where the hell have you been? he barked, then saw Tom and stopped. His eyes flicked to the wire spool, the dust on our faces. He understood without being told. He looked at his watch. "We're pulling out now," he said. "Signals you're with me. We've got one last message to send, then we cut and go." One last message sounded simple. It never is. We ran to the command post, a shallow dugout with a map table lit by a hooded lamp. A captain stood over it, pencil tapping nervously. He spoke into a handset, waiting for confirmation, then slammed it down in frustration. "Line unstable," he snapped at Yusuf. "I need brigade now." Yusuf checked the connections, cranked the set again, listened. His face tightened. He looked at me. "What?" I asked. He handed me the handset. "Listen." At first I heard only crackle, then a faint voice, broken, smeared by distance and interference. "Cut off ammo low can't." The voice was not from our brigade. It was someone else, somewhere forward, calling into a line that was dissolving. I felt my skin go cold. "They're still out there," I said. The captain snatched the handset. "Identify yourself," he demanded. The voice came again, clearer for a second. "Indian platoon north of," then a burst of static like tearing cloth. The captain's eyes met Yusuf's. "Can you trace that?" Yusuf shook his head slowly. "Not precisely, but it's on the forward line." The captain swore under his breath, then looked at his map. His finger hovered, uncertain. I knew that uncertainty. It was the same uncertainty that had lived in my chest when Tom asked for help. Only now it belonged to a man with authority, and that made it more dangerous. The captain spoke, voice tight. "We don't have time, we're ordered back if we delay." Another voice, closer now, broke through the handset, and this time it was unmistakably Indian English, clipped by strain. This is Naik Raghav, we are holding, but they are coming, please." The word "please" did not belong on a military line. It belonged in homes, in markets, in prayers. Hearing it here felt like a knife turning. The captain closed his eyes for a brief second, as if he was trying to picture the faces attached to that voice. Then he opened them and made a decision that looked like it cost him something. "Send coordinates to battalion," he told Yusuf. "Tell them there are men forward still holding. Tell them we need a pickup or covering fire." Yusuf nodded and began to transmit, his hands moving quickly. Outside, engines roared. Someone shouted that enemy armor had been sighted to the south. The desert night, which had seemed endless, suddenly felt like it was running out. When Yusuf finished, the captain turned to me. "You," he said, "you're a signaller, you know what that voice meant. If they don't get out, they're finished." I couldn't tell if he was accusing me or begging me. I swallowed. "Yes, sir." He pointed toward the vehicles. "Get to the trucks, now." I started to move, then stopped, because the handset was still alive with faint sound, breathing, distant shouts, the edge of a firefight. Tom appeared at the dugout entrance. "What's happening?" he asked. The captain looked at him, then back at the handset, then at the map. For a moment everything held still, the retreat, the orders, the fear. It felt like the desert was watching to see what kind of men we would be next. Then faintly through the crackle, Naik Raghav's voice came again, smaller now, as if he were speaking from inside smoke. "They are on us," he said. "If anyone can hear, tell my brother." The line broke into static. And in the sudden silence, I realized with a sick certainty that the war was about to ask us for another choice, one that might not let us come back this time. For a few seconds, none of us moved. The captain stared at the handset like it had become an accusation. Outside, engines kept starting and stopping, men yelling the same instructions twice because panic makes everyone half-deaf. The lamp over the map threw a small circle of light, and beyond it, the dugout felt like a cave. Tom's jaw worked as if he were chewing a decision. Yusuf reached out and gently took the handset from the captain's grip. He listened, not for words, there were none now, only for any hint of a living line. He cranked once, slow, patient. Static answered him like wind through dry grass. "It's gone," Yusuf said. The captain exhaled hard, then pulled his cap lower as if it could hide his face from responsibility. "We can't chase ghosts," he said, more to himself than to us. "We're under orders." Tom stepped forward. "Sir," he said, voice controlled but tight, "they weren't ghosts, that was a platoon." The captain's eyes flicked to him. "I know what it was." "Then let us go," Tom said. "Give us a carrier. 5 minutes forward, 5 back, we'll bring whoever's left." The captain stared at Tom as if measuring what sort of madness he was dealing with. And if you don't come back. Tom didn't hesitate, then we don't come back. In that moment, I understood something I had not understood earlier in the war. Bravery is not always a sudden charge. Sometimes it's the refusal to accept a clean ending when you know someone else is still bleeding in the dirt. The captain looked at me and Yusuf. "You two will go with him," he asked, and his tone was sharp, almost angry, like he wanted us to say no so he could stay a good officer. Yusuf's face was calm. "If you allow," he said. My mouth was dry. I thought of my mother's silence at Hara. I thought of Amina pressing that tin into my palm as if she could pack protection. Then I thought of that voice, Naik Raghav, trying to send a last message into a line that was collapsing. "Yes, sir," I said. For a second the captain's expression softened, and I saw what he had been before command turned him into a man who counted risk in other people's bodies. Then he hardened again. "Fine," he said. "You take Corporal Haynes and his carrier. You do not go beyond the forward tape line. You do not improvise heroics. You bring back who you can, and if you can't, you come back anyway. Understood?" "Understood," Yusuf said. Tom nodded once. I could tell he'd already decided the words, "do not improvise heroics," were not going to survive contact with reality. We ran. Outside, the air was cold enough to bite. A line of vehicles was already forming, engines low, lights covered. Men looked at us as we passed, and in their eyes I saw that strange mixture of admiration and relief. Admiration that someone is going forward, relief that it isn't them. Haynes was by the carrier, checking the Bren gun mount with quick, efficient hands. He was a thin man with a permanent squint, as if the world was always too bright. "You lot are mad," he said when the captain's runner delivered the order. But he climbed into the driver's seat without complaint. Yusuf shoved the telephone set into the carrier, then his own small tool roll, pliers, tape, spare wire connectors, things that felt almost ridiculous next to metal and bullets, but were the only reason I had any right to be there. I jumped in beside him. Tom clambered on last, one hand gripping the rim, the other holding his rifle. He looked back toward the line of retreating trucks toward the safe direction. "Move," he told Haynes. The carrier lurched forward. We rattled over sand and shallow ruts, following a faint track that had been used all day by supply trucks until mines and shells turned it into a warning. The carrier's engine growled like an animal forced awake. "Where was the call from?" Haynes shouted over the noise. The captain had pointed on the map, north of the Wadi, a small rise marked with a pencil cross. A place that did not deserve to decide whether men lived or died. "There," I yelled, pointing into darkness. "About 2 kilometers." Haynes spat into the sand. 2 kilometers in the wrong direction feels longer than 10 in the right one. The ground ahead flickered with distant muzzle flashes. It wasn't a single front line. It was a rough conversation of gunfire, with pauses and sudden outbursts, men arguing with death in the only language they had. We slowed near the forward tape line. The white markers appeared again, fluttering, innocent and cruel. Haynes steered carefully along the marked path, wheels following the safest memory of those who had walked it before. Every time the carrier bounced, my stomach tightened. I kept imagining the mine, an unseen plate under the sand, waiting for our weight. We reached the point where the track forked. Haynes stopped. "Which way?" he asked. Tom leaned out, scanning. "Left," he said, then hesitated. "No, wait." The darkness was thick. The land was full of shallow dips and rises, nothing obvious, nothing reliable. A flare went up far off and lit the desert for a heartbeat. In that harsh light I saw bodies, small shapes scattered irregularly like dropped bundles. The flare died and the bodies vanished again, but I couldn't unsee them. Yusuf touched my arm. "Don't stare," he said quietly. "If you stare, you'll stop moving." Tom pointed again, more certain. "Left," he said. "There's a low ridge. They might be holding behind it." Haynes eased the carrier forward. We hadn't gone far when bullets snapped overhead, sharp cracking sounds that made the air feel solid. Haynes swore and ducked instinctively, though the carrier's low armor was the only thing between us and the night's teeth. "Contact," he shouted. Tom lifted his rifle and fired a short controlled burst toward the flashes. The muzzle blast lit his face, and in that brief light he looked ferocious, almost like someone else. "Keep moving," Tom yelled. Haynes pushed forward, the carrier's engine climbed in pitch. Sand sprayed behind us. Then a darker shape loomed ahead, a cluster of rocks, or what passed for rocks in that landscape. The carrier jolted over a ridge and dipped into a shallow hollow. Voices rose from the dark, sudden and close. "Stop, stop," someone shouted, and the accent was Indian. Haynes slammed the brakes, the carrier shuddered, Tom jumped down first, hands up. "Friendly," he called, "we heard your call, we're here to take you out." A figure emerged, helmet low, face smeared with sand and sweat. He aimed a rifle at Tom for a fraction too long, then lowered it as if the act itself exhausted him. "I am Nake Raghav," the man said. His voice was hoarse but steady, like a rope frayed yet still holding. "Who are you?" "Driver Bennett," Tom said quickly. "This is Signals, we came as soon as we could." Raghav's eyes moved past Tom to the carrier, then to me and Yusuf. In the dim light I saw he was not old, late 20s perhaps, but war had carved lines into his face anyway. Behind him, shapes shifted. More men crouched low, rifles forward, shoulders hunched with the tension of waiting for the next rush. "How many?" Yusuf asked. Raghav hesitated, then answered honestly. "We were 32, now we are 11 who can still shoot, 4 wounded, the rest," he stopped, his mouth tightened, "the rest are there." He didn't point, but his eyes flicked toward the slope beyond the hollow, toward the place where bodies lay in the dark. "What's in front of you?" Tom asked. "Germans," Raghav said, "and Italians. A patrol found us when we were falling back. We took this position because the ground here is slightly lower. Then they kept coming, we have little ammunition." He looked at me as if I might be able to solve that with wire. "I tried to call," he said, "then the line died." Yusuf nodded. "We heard you." Raghav exhaled like a man who had been holding breath for an hour. "Then take us," he said, "now." It should have been simple. Load wounded, squeeze others onto the carrier, retreat along the tape line. But simple plans die quickly in war. The first complication was weight. A carrier was not a bus. Haynes looked at the number of men and shook his head. "I can take maybe 6, 7 on top of crew," he shouted. "Not 11 plus wounded." The second complication was fire. The moment the enemy realized we were here, they'd concentrate on the carrier. If we made 2 trips, the second trip might be into a trap. Tom looked at Raghav. "Are there any vehicles of yours?" he asked. Raghav gave a bitter laugh. "Vehicles, we walked." A wounded sepoy groaned behind him. Another man, face wrapped in a dusty scarf, pressed a cloth to a bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide and bright. Haynes swore again. "If we sit here arguing, we'll all be dead." Yusuf crouched beside me. "We can do something," he said under his breath. "What?" I asked. He pointed to the shallow hollow, then to the ridge behind us. "If we can lay a short line back to that abandoned cable we used earlier, the one we tapped, maybe we can call for a second carrier, or at least artillery smoke. But we need time." Time was exactly what Raghav didn't have. Tom made a quick decision. "Load the wounded," he said. "2 worst first, then 2 men with them, the rest of you move on foot behind the carrier, use it as cover until the tape line, then run." Raghav stared at him. "We will be shot." Tom's eyes were hard. "You might," he said, "but if you stay, you will be." Raghav looked at his men. They looked back, waiting for his voice to become their courage. He swallowed and nodded. "All right," he said, then sharper, "do as he says." They moved with the obedience of exhausted men. 2 wounded were lifted, one with a leg bandaged thickly, one clutching his stomach as if trying to keep his insides from leaving him. They were placed into the carrier. 2 men climbed in with them, one holding a canteen to a cracked mouth. That still left too many. Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Arif," he said, "you and Yusuf, can you lay your line now?" My heart hammered. "Here." "Here," Tom said. "If we can get smoke on that ridge line, we can move the rest." Yusuf was already pulling wire from the carrier, hands quick, mind in its familiar language of connections. He looked at me once, and there was no fear in his eyes, only focus. We crawled. The sand in the hollow was cold and smelled faintly of burnt metal. I paid out wire, pushing it into the sand with my palm to keep it from snagging. Yusuf moved ahead, finding a point where the abandoned cable ran, if it still ran, toward our lines. Shots cracked above us. Dirt spat up near my elbow. I flinched involuntarily. "Keep low," Yusuf murmured. "The wire doesn't care if you're afraid." He found the cable, half buried, exactly where we'd left the join earlier in the night. He stripped insulation with his knife, hands steady. I held the wire end, trying not to shake. In the distance, enemy voices carried faintly short, sharp syllables. Then a burst of machine gun fire and one of Raghav's men shouted in pain. Yusuf twisted the copper ends together, taped them, taped again. He clipped the handset leads on and cranked. Static, then faintly voice. "This is," Yusuf began, then the line crackled. A British voice answered, impatient, "Who is this?" Yusuf spoke fast, clear. "Forward party with Naik Raghav's platoon. Request immediate smoke or covering fire on ridge line grid." He looked at me. I shouted the coordinates the captain had indicated earlier, praying they were close enough. Yusuf repeated them flawlessly. There was a pause, then stand by. Again that phrase. A flare went up closer now, and for a second the ridge in front of us became bright. I saw silhouettes moving, enemy shapes, low and quick. They were not a mass, they were individuals hunting. Raghav's rifle cracked. Another. Tom fired 2 short bursts to discourage, not to kill. Ammunition was precious. The wounded man with the stomach wound began to moan. His friend pressed his head down gently, whispering something I couldn't hear. Yusuf held the handset to his ear, as if listening could force the answer faster. Then the voice came back. "Smoke available, 2 rounds, mark your position." Yusuf's reply was immediate. "We have a carrier in hollow. Mark ridge line ahead of us, 50 meters, fire now." "Roger," the voice said, "incoming." I didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. Artillery doesn't care who it helps if coordinates are wrong. We waited, teeth clenched. The first smoke shell landed with a dull thump on the ridgeline. A white cloud began to bloom, slowly at first, then thickening. The second landed a little further left. More smoke, spreading in the wind, a shifting curtain. Tom saw it and shouted, "Now, move now." Haynes revved the carrier. It surged forward, climbing out of the hollow. The men who couldn't fit ran behind it, crouched low, using its bulk as moving cover. Raghav ran with them, one hand on a wounded man's back, pushing him forward as if force could replace blood. Enemy fire intensified, bullets snapping into the carrier's sides with metallic pings. One struck near my ear. The sound was like a hammer on a tin drum. I pressed myself down, wire spool forgotten, my body suddenly wanting only to be small. Then a man screamed behind us. I twisted to look. One of Raghav's men had gone down, legs folding. He clawed at the sand, trying to drag himself forward. Another man turned back for him. "Leave him," Raghav shouted, voice breaking. "Leave him." The second man hesitated, half a second, and that half second was all the war needed. He jerked as a bullet hit him. He fell beside the first, 2 bodies tangled like brothers. Raghav's face contorted, and I saw the moment his leadership became a wound he would carry longer than any scar. But he kept running. He kept pushing the others forward. Because leadership in war is sometimes the act of surviving your own guilt. The smoke thickened, obscuring the ridge. We reached the tape line. Haynes slowed just enough to stay on the safe path. The men behind the carrier stumbled onto it, then ran faster as if the white markers were a bridge over hell. A burst of fire came from the side, too close. The carrier lurched. "Haynes," Tom yelled. "I'm hit," Haynes shouted back, arms bloody, still driving. His left arm was dark with blood, but his hands remained on the controls. We pushed on. Then suddenly the carrier's engine coughed. Once, twice. The sound changed, uneven, sick. "No," Haynes muttered, more like a prayer than a word. The engine sputtered again, the carrier slowed. My stomach dropped. A carrier stopped on a mined path with men following behind it is not a vehicle anymore. It's a coffin that hasn't decided when to close. Tom slapped the side panel, "Keep it going." Haynes grimaced, "I'm trying." The engine died. For a split second there was no sound but distant gunfire and the wind. Then everything rushed in at once. Footsteps, shouted orders, panicked breathing. "Move off the path," someone yelled. "Don't step off," someone else screamed. "Mines." The carrier sat like a stranded beast. Tom jumped down. He ripped open a side panel and started fumbling with the engine housing like he could intimidate it into life. "Tom," I shouted, "we'll get blowns." "Help me," he snapped, and there was no time for argument. I jumped down too, careful where I placed my boots. Yusuf followed. Raghav and 2 of his men formed a rough line facing the smoke, firing short bursts to keep enemy heads down. "What's wrong?" I asked, leaning in. Haynes was pale, sweat shining on his forehead. Fuel line, he said, or sand in the intake, something blocked. Tom's hands were black with grease already. Arif, give me your knife, he said. I handed it over. Tom cut away a strip of rubber hose, then shoved it back on, tightening it with trembling fingers. Start it, he told Haynes. Haynes turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then caught weakly, like a man trying to breathe after being punched. For a second it held. Then gunfire raked the sand near us, closer now because the smoke was thinning. Something struck the carrier with a loud clang. Another hit. Tom threw himself across the engine compartment, as if his body could shield machinery. Go, he yelled, go now. Haynes gunned it. The carrier lurched forward again, slow but moving. Tom didn't climb back in immediately. He stayed on the outside, pushing for a few steps, then grabbed the rim and hauled himself up. As he did, his body jerked hard, his hands slipped. For a moment I didn't understand. Then I saw the dark spreading on his shirt just below the ribs. Tom made a sound that wasn't a scream, more like surprise. He tried to hold on. His fingers were suddenly weak. I grabbed him, Tom. He looked at me. His face was strangely calm, as if his mind had stepped away from pain to watch events from a distance. Don't stop, he breathed. I pulled him into the carrier. Yusuf pressed a cloth to the wound instantly, his movements automatic. Tom's breath came shallow. He tried to speak again, but it came out as a cough, wet and awful. Raghav climbed in as we moved, last of his men scrambling after him, not all. I counted heads and knew with a cold certainty that 2 had been left on the sand and 1 more hadn't made the tape line. But the rest were here, packed tight, eyes wide, alive. The carrier rattled on, following the tape back toward our lines. The retreating vehicles were visible ahead now, a faint line of movement under the night. I held Tom's hand because it was the only thing I could do that felt human. His skin was cold despite the desert. You're going to be all right, I lied, because sometimes lying is an act of love. He looked at me and tried to smile, it barely formed. Manchester, he whispered. What? I said, leaning close. Snow, he murmured, you'll see it. His eyes fluttered. Yusuf kept pressure on the wound, jaw clenched, but I could see in his face that he knew what I didn't want to know. Tom's grip tightened once like a final punctuation, then it loosened. His eyes stayed open, staring at nothing. The carrier kept moving and the war did not pause for him. When we reached the command area, men rushed toward us, shouting for medics, for stretchers, for water. Raghav's wounded were pulled out. Someone tried to lift Tom too. I shook my head before anyone asked. He's gone, I said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone older. A medic looked at him anyway, out of habit more than hope. Then he covered Tom's face with a cloth. For a moment, everything I had been holding back broke loose inside me. Not as crying, not yet, but as a hot pressure behind my eyes and a trembling in my chest that felt like rage. Rage at the bullet, at the desert, at the map table, at the idea that a man could promise snow and be answered by sand and blood. Raghav stood beside the carrier, swaying slightly as adrenaline drained away. His face was streaked with dust like dried tears. He looked at Tom's covered face, then at me. He died for us, he said, voice flat. I couldn't answer. If I spoke, I thought I might shout at him, or at God, or at no one at all. Raghav turned and walked toward the captain's dugout. His men followed, carrying the wounded, moving like a small shadow of an army. Yusuf touched my shoulder lightly. Come, he said, we still have to cut the line. I stared at him. How can you talk about lines? I asked, and the bitterness in my voice surprised me. Yusuf's eyes didn't harden, they softened, which somehow hurt more. Because, he said quietly, if we stop, then he died for nothing. We went back to the field exchange and began disconnecting equipment under the captain's orders. Hands moved, tools clicked, messages were sent and acknowledged. The retreat resumed its rhythm. But in my head the night replayed in fragments. Tom's voice saying my name like a responsibility, the smoke blooming, the carrier engine dying, Tom whispering snow. Before dawn we were miles back. The horizon lightened from black to gray. The desert looked peaceful again in that dishonest morning way, as if it had not swallowed men a few hours earlier. When we halted briefly, I took out my notebook, the one I had started because the Sikh Havildar on the train had said writing saves you. My hands shook as I wrote, not a report, not a military message, just a sentence I needed to exist somewhere outside my skull. Tom Bennett died last night, so that men he did not know could go home. I stared at the words until they blurred. Later that day, the captain came to our section. He looked at me, then at Yusuf. His face was drawn. "You did well," he said. It sounded inadequate and he knew it. He cleared his throat. "Naik Raghav and 8 men are alive because you went. Brigade will record it." "Record it," I repeated, and the phrase tasted like ash. The captain held my gaze. "Don't mistake me," he said. "I know what it costs, and I know I ordered you into it." He paused, then added something softer, almost personal. "Bennett was a good lad." I nodded once because I didn't trust myself to speak. That evening, as we moved again, I found myself walking beside Raghav for a short stretch. He looked like a man who had aged years in one night. He spoke without looking at me. "In my village," he said, "we have a saying, if you eat salt with someone, you are responsible for him." I didn't answer. "I ate his salt," Raghav continued. "He died, so now I am responsible for his mother too, yes, and his sister if he has one." I swallowed. "He was from Manchester," I said. "He talked about snow, he said I'd see it." Raghav's eyes flicked to me briefly. "Then you must see it," he said. "Otherwise, what is the point of promises?" Night came again because it always does, and with it the endless movement of retreat and regrouping. In the quiet between halts, I finally wrote a letter to Amina. I started 3 times and tore the pages because every sentence sounded wrong. How do you explain that you watched a friend die and the world kept going? In the end, I wrote something simple, because simple is the only truth that survives war. "Amina, I lost a friend. His name was Tom. He was kind. He saved men. Please pray for him even if you do not know his religion. I think God understands names more than uniforms." I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others, knowing it would take weeks to reach her, if it reached her at all. And in the dark, with the desert wind rubbing sand against canvas like a whisper, I understood that the war had changed shape for me. It was no longer posters and speeches, no longer maps and empires. It was names. It was the weight of a hand going limp in yours. It was the sound of a voice saying please into a dying line. It was the terrible, stubborn decision to go forward anyway. We moved for 2 more nights, always west, always away from the places that had names people would later memorize. The retreat had its own sound. Engines kept low, canvas snapping, men whispering when there was no reason to whisper, as if speaking normally might attract shells. The desert that had looked endless on the way in now felt like a corridor we were being pushed down. Tom's body went with the medical convoy. There was no ceremony. A chaplain said words somewhere and a clerk wrote something somewhere, and the war swallowed another name without chewing. I kept expecting grief to arrive like a clean thing, like rain, like a knock on a door. Instead, it came in small ambushes. A cigarette offered by a stranger, the sound of an Englishman laughing in the dark, the word Manchester on a lorry's stencil. Each time my chest tightened as if it had learned a new reflex. Yusuf watched me in the way older men watch younger ones, when they know the younger man has crossed a line and cannot return to who he was. One evening he handed me a tin mug of tea and sat beside me on an ammunition crate. "You think you could have saved him," he said. I stared at the tea, the surface trembling slightly with my hands. Could I? Yusuf did not answer quickly. He did not offer comfort cheaply. "You can save a man from dying alone," he said at last. "That is not a small thing, but you cannot save him from death if death has already chosen him." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say death does not choose, men choose, generals choose, empires choose. But the truth was, a bullet doesn't care whose plan it is obeying. The next letter from home reached me weeks later, crumpled and dusty, with the censor's stamp like a bruise across the flap. Amina's handwriting looked thinner, as if even ink had become expensive. She wrote that Calcutta had changed. There were more uniforms in the streets, more shortages, more rumors. She wrote that mother had stopped going to the river in the mornings because she didn't like the way the air raid sirens made the water birds lift in panic. Then she wrote the sentence that made my throat close. "There is hunger in the city now, and in the villages it is worse." She did not call it famine. People rarely name a disaster while it is still happening. They name it later when they need to explain their dead. She wrote that prices had risen, that rice was scarce, that lines formed outside shops before dawn. She wrote that Mother said not to worry, but Mother's idea of not worrying had always been stubbornness, not truth. At the bottom, Amina had added in smaller letters, "If you can, send something, not only money, send assurance." Assurance, as if I could pack safety into an envelope and mail it across oceans. I went to the pay office the next day and sent as much of my wages as regulations allowed. I stood over the form, pen hovering, then wrote an extra line in the remarks space that no one had asked for food. The clerk looked at it, expression blank, and stamped it anyway. After that, I began to understand something I hadn't before. A man can be fighting for his life in one part of the world and still be helpless about his family starving in another. War doesn't just kill bodies. It kills the illusion that you can protect what you love by being brave. In October 1942, the tone changed again, this time not into retreat but into preparation. We were dug in near El Alamein, a narrow place between the sea and the Calcutta Depression where the desert finally stopped being endless and became a wall. Men said with a kind of desperate hope that this would be the stand, that there would be no more running. By then I had learned to distrust hope because it hurts when it breaks. But I also knew what it meant when an army stopped moving backward. It meant someone had decided to risk everything. The night the battle began, the horizon lit with artillery so dense it looked like the earth had grown a new line of lightning. The sound was not like thunder. Thunder is natural. This was mechanical, continuous, a hammering that seemed to press on the ribs from the outside. Our job was simple on paper. Keep the lines working between forward units and brigade, repair breaks, relay messages, keep the invisible nervous system alive while the body bled. Simple on paper is never simple in sand. When the barrage started, the air filled with dust and the smell of cordite. Men moved forward through lanes cut in minefields, following tape and stakes and the nervous instructions of engineers. Somewhere ahead, tanks clanked like giants in the dark. At a forward exchange point, a corporal shoved a handset at me. "Line, dead to be company," he shouted. I put the earpiece to my head. Static, no voice, no crackle, just the dull hiss of emptiness. Yusuf was beside me, already opening his tool roll. "Break is forward," he said, listening as if he could hear distance inside the wire. "Of course it is," I muttered, and then hated myself for it. Men were moving into fire and I was complaining about walking. We crawled out following the cable. The ground was pocked and uneven from shell bursts. Every few seconds the sky strobed with flashes. It was bright enough to see and too bright to feel safe. A line of infantry moved past us, bent low under their packs, rifles held close. One of them glanced at me as he went by and I recognized him, the uninjured soldier from the mine hit weeks earlier. His eyes widened. "You," he said, as if he couldn't decide whether to thank me or blame me for being alive. Then he was swallowed by darkness and noise. We found the break near a shallow crater. The cable had been severed cleanly, copper ends exposed like bone. A shell fragment glittered nearby. It looked harmless now, lying still as if it hadn't just ruined a connection and maybe cost lives. Yusuf stripped the wire ends. I held the torch low, shielding it with my body. My hands worked, steady from repetition, but my heart was beating in my throat. Above us, something screamed, an incoming shell close enough that the sound felt personal. We flattened instinctively. The blast hit somewhere behind, the ground lifting under us. Sand showered down, my mouth filled with grit. Yusuf didn't swear. He didn't flinch beyond what his body couldn't avoid. He simply rolled back to the cable and continued joining copper as if composure itself was an act of defiance. When the connection was taped and buried, I put the handset to my ear again. This time there was a faint click, then a voice, thin but alive. "Hello, hello, this is B Company, who is that?" Relief hit me so sharply it made me dizzy. "Signals," I said, line restored. The voice on the other end laughed once, short and disbelieving. "Bless you," the man said, and then immediately, "Enemy MG at," and he began giving coordinates because gratitude is brief in war and necessity is constant. When we crawled back, Yusuf's sleeve was torn and his forearm was bleeding. He hadn't noticed. "You're hit," I told him. He glanced at it. "No," he said, tying a strip of cloth around it. "This is a reminder." That night, through dust and noise and fear, the line stayed alive. And somewhere in the chaos, I realized what Tom had been without ever saying it. Not a hero in the poster sense, but a man who refused to let other men be abandoned in silence. The battle lasted days. Men slept in minutes, ate without tasting, urinated where they stood because walking away felt like inviting death. We kept repairing and relaying, until exhaustion became a background condition like heat. When it was over, when the enemy began to fall back and the rumor spread, cautious at first, then louder, that we had held, I expected to feel joy. What I felt instead was emptiness, and then a strange guilt for being alive to feel anything at all. A week later, I found the place where Tom was buried. They had begun to gather graves into order, but order was still unfinished. The cemetery was a work in progress, like everything else in war. A chaplain showed me the plot number. I walked between markers under a pale sky and stopped at a simple cross with his name. Thomas Billion. I stared at it for a long time. I had met men who prayed loudly and men who mocked prayer. Standing there, I didn't know which kind I was. In the end, I did the only honest thing. I spoke to him as if he could hear. "You were right," I said quietly. "The forgetting is the part that scares me." The wind moved through the markers. It sounded like distant surf. I took out my notebook and wrote his name again, carefully, as if writing could pin him to the world. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I wrote down his mother's address from his effects list, which had been typed for paperwork, and I wrote her a letter. I told her I was an Indian signaller who had known her son for a short time. I told her he had shared cigarettes, that he had joked even in heat, that he had been brave in the way that mattered. I did not describe his wound. I did not describe the moment his hand loosened. Mothers don't need that kind of truth. They carry enough. I ended with one line I hoped was not stupid. "He spoke of you without shame, the way good sons do." I posted it and tried not to imagine it traveling across oceans, while bombs also traveled across oceans. Time moved, campaigns shifted, units were reassigned. The war, which had once been a single frightening idea, became a chain of places. Tunisia, then transport ships again, then Italy, hills instead of sand, mud instead of dust, cold that made your fingers stiff around wire and tools. In the winter of 1943, in the Italian mountains, I saw snow for the first time. It didn't arrive like a miracle. It arrived like weather, gray clouds pressing low, air turning sharp, then small white flakes drifting down with no drama at all. Men cursed at it, vehicles struggled, boots slipped, everything became slower, heavier. War, which is already heavy, became heavier. I stood outside a tent and held my palm out. A few flakes landed and melted immediately, leaving tiny cold points on my skin. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. All I could hear was Tom's voice, half laughing, half serious, saying I'd see it. I didn't cry loudly. I didn't fall to my knees. I simply stood there with my palm open like a fool, letting the snow vanish as quickly as it arrived, and in that vanishing I felt the whole truth of it. Promises are real even when the man who made them is not. That night I wrote to Amina again. "I have seen snow," I wrote. "It is quieter than I imagined. It falls as if the world is trying to speak softly after shouting for too long." Weeks later, a reply arrived, not from Amina but from England. Tom's mother. The envelope was plain, the handwriting was careful. Inside was a letter that smelled faintly of soap, the smell of a home that had never been mine. She thanked me for writing. She said she had been waiting for anything that would make her son feel less like a government telegram. She told me he had played football as a boy and had once broken a neighbor's window and cried harder than the neighbor did. Then she wrote something that made my eyes sting more than any battlefield smoke. "He always wanted to be the sort of man who brought people back. I am glad he was, even at the end." At the bottom she had added, "If you ever come to Manchester, my door is open to you." I folded the letter and kept it in my breast pocket for months, until the paper grew soft at the edges. I didn't know whether I would ever go to Manchester. I only knew that a door being open in a world of trenches and minefields felt like a kind of salvation. In 1945, the war ended in Europe in a way that felt almost anticlimactic at our level. No single moment, no trumpet, just the gradual spread of certainty through units, through towns, through exhausted faces. Men cheered, men drank. Some men went quiet and stayed quiet. I watched others celebrate and felt happy for them, and then felt guilty again because Tom was not there to be happy, and because in Bengal people had been starving while we were firing shells by the thousand. When demobilization finally came, the paperwork was thick, the instructions confusing, the waiting long. Then suddenly I was on a ship again, heading east, not into war but away from it. The sea looked calmer than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply become someone who measured danger differently. When I reached Calcutta, the city smelled like rain on hot stone and diesel and too many people. I stood once more near Howrah, older than the boy who had left. The Hooghly was still the color of tea. The ferry horn still sounded tired. My mother was smaller. That was the first thing I noticed when she came into the doorway. Not weaker, my mother had never been weak but physically smaller, as if worry had carved away inches. She stared at me for a long second, eyes fierce, as if she didn't trust the world to give her what it had stolen. Then she touched my face with her fingers quickly, almost impatiently. "You're thin," she said, "because mothers cannot speak first about fear. Did they feed you at all?" I tried to laugh, it came out rough. Amina stood behind her. She looked older too, but there was steel in her posture. When our eyes met, she didn't cry this time. She simply nodded once, like a sister acknowledging that her brother had returned from somewhere she had been forced to imagine. Later, when the house was quiet, I told them about parts of it. Not everything. You don't pour war into a family home all at once. You drip it carefully so it doesn't drown the people you love. I told Amina about the desert heat, about sand and food, about the way stars looked too close in Egypt. I told my mother that I had done my job and come back. I did not say Tom's name at first. I didn't know how to bring an Englishman into that room without making him sound like a story. But one evening when the power cut and we sat by a small lamp, Amina asked quietly, "Did you lose friends?" "Oh, yes," I said. She waited. So I told them about Tom and about the carrier and about the snow promise. I told them about Nake Raghav too, and the way he had shouted at his own man to keep running, the way that shout had saved some and damned others. My mother listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a long time. "People think bravery is loud," she said at last. "But what you did, you carried messages, you kept voices connected, that is also bravery." Amina reached over and took my hand, the same hand she had once pressed a tin into. "Did you ever tell his mother?" she asked. "I did," I said. She wrote back. Amina nodded slowly. "Then he didn't vanish," she said, "not completely." That night after they slept, I opened my notebook. Pages filled with dates, broken lines, names written too carefully. I realized something that made me sit very still. All through the war I had been laying wire, repairing wire, protecting wire, because wire carried meaning. It carried pleas. It carried orders. It carried last messages meant for brothers. And now, back in Calcutta, I could feel new lines being drawn everywhere, in politics, in neighborhoods, even in how people looked at each other in the bazaar. Lines on maps. Lines in minds. The war had taught me that lines can save you, and lines can also kill you, depending on who controls them. I didn't know what India would become, I didn't know what Calcutta would become, but I knew what I would try to be. Not a man who loved war stories, not a man who collected medals like proof of worth, but a man who remembered names and who, when someone called out into noise and distance, tried to answer. Before sleeping, I wrote one final sentence beneath Tom's name, and beneath the names of the men I had heard but never seen. "If you can hear me, you are not alone." And for the first time since Egypt, the world felt quiet in a way that did not threaten me.